suggest we get started with this webinar on supply chain management and what's going to happen with supply chains after potentially after the crisis on Corona. And I think it's a presentation serves as serves the purpose today to basically try to understand how certain things are potentially evolving after Corona. And especially in the supply chain setting, we want you, at least we want to share some of our ideas with you. So I'm Tom van Woensel. I will introduce myself in a second, and Edwin Wenink, who also will introduce himself in a second as well. So without much ado, let's get going with introductions. So let me just see. Then I need to push this. So I'm Tom van Woensel. I'm at this moment in time, I'm a professor at the Eindhoven University of Technology, and I'm also a professor at the Antwerp Management School. And I'm working mainly on supply chain in a broad sense, and maybe a bit more narrow sense, transportation, logistics, and everything around these type of moving parts in the supply chain, if you want. So I'm of course doing this in the University of Technology in Eindhoven and in the Antwerp Management School. In the Antwerp Management School, I'm also the director of the academic director of the Global Supply Chain Management Program, and there, which is a master after master program with around 50 students participating and trying to get experts in everything related to supply chain. So in that sense, this is a bit my profile and how I'm operating the last 20 years. I will now want to, my next slide is about Edwin. So I will give Edwin also the floor to say something about himself. Edwin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Tom. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Edwin Wenink. Actually, I've been actively working since 1996. I started my career at Hoyer, which is a large logistics service provider, mainly transporting all kinds of chemicals and goods in bulk. And after that, I moved to Royal Florida and being able to, let's say, do a lot of innovations in the supply chain since 2007. And since last year, actually, I've become an independent consultant. And I've been working, for instance, with Tom already since 2010 in several projects. And I'm also part of the European Supply Chain Forum, which is also led by Tom. I have my experience in innovation in supply chain and logistics. I really like to work with people, and I have a passion for change management. And besides that, I love to do this type of webinars and seminars and talk to people and learn from you in the field. So looking forward to an in-depth discussion, perhaps via the chat, or perhaps later at the end of our presentation. And any kind of comments is welcome, of course, during our presentation. Thank you. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Edwin. So the idea of the webinar is basically that we are sharing some of our thoughts with you. So we would be very happy to also hear from you, of course, whether what we are talking about might not be clear or might not be making sense, or you would like to have some clarifications. In all cases, please use the chat function, because we will be having, we will keep an eye on the chat function, and any questions which are popping up there, we will try to answer them throughout the presentation. So throughout the webinar, you can ask these questions. And obviously also at the end of the webinar, we also have some time available to handle any more questions you would like to raise at that time, at that point in time. So by all means, use the chat function, and we will try to get back to you as soon as possible, whatever you're talking about at that time. Also, please make sure that you send it to all attendants, because then everybody can have a can see the questions coming in. So there are, as far as you will see, there are two options. There is an option all panelists and attendees. So if you send it to all panelists and attendees, everybody will see your question, which is also, of course, quite, which would be okay for everybody to see the questions then. Otherwise, we only see the questions, which would be a bit maybe not broad. I think it would be nice to broadly share questions. Okay, so at a certain point, I think Edwin and I, we were talking about what is going to happen and how are we going to go beyond with these Corona COVID-19 crisis, and what are observations we see, and how are these supply chains evolving, and why are we seeing, in a sense, um, these issues which we are observing now in supply chains and supply chain management and controlling these type of supply chains, and why are certain, let's say, supply chains so bad in terms of reacting to these kind of disruptions, and if we can understand why they are so bad in terms of handling these type of disruptions, like COVID-19 or whatever, how can we actually mitigate these kind of observations by building a more sustainable, more resilient type of supply chain? Obviously, the ones who are able to change and the ones who are able to react in a proper way, they seem to be more successful than others, where it seems to be a bit more rigid. Now, clearly, I think also there are reasons why this is happening, and I think it's important in that sense to also go back a bit to a historical perspective on why we have supply chains and how these supply chains are geared up at this moment in time, and why we actually have set these kind of supply chains. So I don't want to give here a complete course on supply chain management. I think that would be a very interesting setting, but then you will need to hear me probably for another week or two and to talk about anything related to supply chain. So this is a bit a selection of how I see why we are where we are at these kind of things with these supply chains. So if you look back in the 40s, 50s, right after the Second World War, there was a lot of work being done in terms of trying to get away from more labor-intensive processes to more and more mechanization type of processes. You'd see that also at that time a fantastic invention came into the picture, the container, where we could actually use standardization, where we could actually work around the globe and have a sort of a standard unit of moving boxes around the world, and these kind of let's say evolutions were the seed to actually get into this kind of improvements of efficiency in a sense in optimizing these type of supply chains. And that's a bit what you see that happening in the 60s to 80s, a bit more, even more into the 80s, where we are talking about these kind of more and more talking about advanced planning tools, mechanisms to improve upon supply chain efficiency. It's about technology. It's the years of using advanced type of technology and planning tools. And at the end of the ride, you see that from 1980s onwards, you see that globalization and global supply chains really took off. And you see that all of a sudden, the supply chains are basically worldwide, doing everything worldwide, are basically manufacturing in one location, even sometimes in 20 locations, doing all type of connections in terms of sourcing and where to source. We start talking about first-tier suppliers, second-tier suppliers, third-tier suppliers. So all these kind of things are happening, and it is quite much driven by a cost perspective. Of course, I also am aware of the fact that we are talking more and more last years about sustainability and these kind of things. But you see that there is a lot of cost focus and trying to improve efficiency. And the idea is improving efficiency leads to a cost reduction. And this basically helps the bottom line. And the top line is, of course, what we get. And this together creates larger margins. Now, this is, of course, a quite clear view, and if you look at all the work, I'm also sometimes at least to blame about that, because it's really focusing on creating efficiencies in the supply chain. Now, one thing we are losing a little bit out of sight is a bit how can we actually manage things which are known or unknown. And this is a bit interesting to see is whether our supply chains are really geared up towards protecting ourselves against, let's say, unknown unknowns or known unknowns. And this sounds a bit hocus pocus with words, I'm aware of that. But on the other hand, if you see that this cost efficiency, this improving of efficiencies are actually much easier to control for that if you talk about forecasting, if we talk about what am I going to sell tomorrow, what is going to be the demand tomorrow, what is going to be the expected time of arrival of a certain vessel into the port of Antwerp. All these kind of things are relatively easily to predict and to actually work around and to actually to mitigate possible issues with these kind of things. Now, the higher you go into this graph, if you get closer and closer to the unknown unknown, you also see that we are basically much less protecting ourselves against these kind of things, against, for example, epidemics, which we are talking about right now, but also about any other disasters and so on. And then the question becomes a bit what is this, how severe and how important is it if we're going to really control or do not control for these kind of things. Now, clearly, and I think that is that is of course the challenge, is you see that the lower we get, the closer we get to the known unknown, the better we can actually mitigate problems and risks. And I think also from a supply chain perspective, most of the let's say approaches we have been working around and is trying to manage uncertainty, and we try to do that in efficient, adequate planning type of tools. We try to do that in organizing our manufacturing systems, and then you get into these type of concepts we have been talking about in many flavors, and this is just a sort of a few: lean manufacturing, just in time, we are offshoring, we are outsourcing, and all these kind of things are assuming that we can reasonably well control for the flows, and we can reasonably well control for the let's say uncertainty which is inherent in these type of processes. Now, the higher you get, the more difficulties get. And actually, it's quite interesting to see that there seems to be a sort of a field of tension between the two, because you can even wonder whether this focusing on too much efficiency, whether that is actually leading to sustainable supply chains or to resilient supply chains or supply chains that are able to actually mitigate any risk and any large risk in these supply chains. So I think that's actually what we see happening now, is that we seem to be quite well managing, for example, the standardized kind of processes in a supply chain, and we are able to do fantastic planning tools, SAP, whatever type of tools to go around. We can control for the supply chain in the most stabilized sense with a certain amount of uncertainty. But once we move into this unknown, it seems that we did not prepare our supply chains in a proper way to do that. That's an observation which you don't need to agree with, but that's something I think we have been fighting, or we have been pushing a bit too much into a certain direction. And of course, and I'm just putting some of these kind of indications here. You see all of a sudden that we are if we observe a large disruption in the supply chain, like COVID-19 is, that you see all of a sudden that inventory buffers, which we have available in the supply chain, it's not enough. We actually are talking about weeks of supply or days of supply. If you look on this upper left corner, you see that the coronavirus has a lasting impact on global trade. It's an economist kind of picture. You see that the amount of inventory in the supply chain is very low. If you look at, for example, apparently around 40 days in the highest case, 40 days, it's actually only what is it, 5 weeks, 6 weeks of inventory in the supply chain, while we are now already talking about longer delays in the supply chain because of Corona going around the world. Of course, the other thing is we were used to saying we have an abundant amount of capacity in transportation. We have lots of information, lots of capacity available, for example, in air. You see now, because of that all of a sudden we do not have enough air freighters. We don't have enough air freight capacity, because 40% of the air freight is in passenger planes. So we really have to start thinking about, at least you see that we do not necessarily work around the supply chain, understanding that we might be running into some shortage of capacity, shortage of certain resources, which we never thought they would be falling short. And of course, it's an extremely large disruption. So you can even argue whether this is even at the end of the right you can protect yourself against these kind of things. But this is really an observation that all of a sudden we go from a capacity of 100, we go to a capacity of 20. And how do these supply chains manage that? Now, of course, this is the consequence, of course, at a certain point of focusing on cheap, focusing on fast, focusing on whatever bottom line type of KPIs we are looking into, leading to negatively put a completely squeezed out supply chain in terms of all redundancies, all muda, all waste is out of the supply chain, but we might have done it too far. So my next slide is really looking into how is the supply chain organization, and in terms of how do you organize your supply chain, comparing it to where do you consume. And obviously, if you look at the table on the left, we have been doing a lot in the past. Before we had all this kind of mechanization stuff and being able to standardize with the container, we were basically organizing a supply chain which was quite local, and we also organized this for local consumption. At that time, we were more and more moving into the direction of global for local. So you see basically that we are actually, because of all the considerations, because of efficiency and so on, we try to move to the cheaper labor places. We try to make use of standardization. Transportation was abundantly available, so we could do everything. So we moved into global for local. So we are having a supply chain which is globally organized for local consumption, and we have to organize ourselves into these kind of things. Now, obviously, it might be interesting to also see that whether there are other alternatives in there, and whether we can also, so not necessarily organize our supply chain locally, but maybe more globally or more on a regional level for consumption, which might be local or also region. So this, in a sense, disconnects a little bit continents, or you could disconnect certain risks in the supply chain, which you could actually manage with. Now, obviously, this has two components, as I was saying. There is a risk component in there, and there is a cost component in there. And the boys over here on the right side are actually giving a little bit of an indication in terms of who do you think will be basically the best fit if you would drop him somewhere in Australia in the bush, and which one of these guys would be surviving the best. And then you get a little bit the question whether it's going to be the most left guy, so the tiniest, the thinnest guy, or you would go for the more, let's say, bigger guy, or you would like to be somewhere in the middle. And then the question becomes, where in the middle should we be? And this has a risk and a cost component, of course. Obviously, the ones, if you go to the right, he or she is eating more, so he will be probably a bit more costly, but it might be that the risk might be also a bit less. On the other hand, it might be that the risk is not linear in terms of weight in this case. So it could be that most of our supply chains are now more and more into a phase where we see that they are getting too close to sort of an anorexia type of supply chains, where we basically cut out all the weight out of the supply chain, which is non-added value, which is muda, whatever, and we are basically extremely lean, and maybe we are too lean. Of course, we also need to be aware that we don't want to get into the obesitas kind of environment, because the question becomes a bit, where is this sweet spot then? Where do we want to be with our supply chains? And obviously that's not an easy exercise, and I'm also aware that in this webinar we will not give answers, but I think we probably need to move a bit more away from let's say, cost minimization or these kind of drivers in the supply chain and take more objectives into account, like mitigation for risk and these kind of things as well. So the question is a bit on what level are we in these type of in between these type of people. Now clearly that's easier said than done, and of course it also involves about what type of environment in terms of organization versus consumption do you want to do. My feeling is, and that's a feeling, and I think it would be nice to also hear some discussion afterwards, that we probably need to go more and more into a regional type of supply chain organization rather than having this globalized context, maybe going more and more into a region where the region is producing for the region, for example, so that we basically get more and more into an R for R or an R for local, so that we basically are managing the supply chain probably in a different way, maybe not in the cheapest possible way, but maybe in a more resilient, more sustainable way into the future. Of course, getting there is not easy. And then, of course, we have the slide where we're talking about how do we get there? How would we be able to move our supply chains into this next phase, the post-corona phase? And then I think it would be, it's good to mention this quote from Einstein, where we are talking about whether with the problems we are basically, we created, whether we can solve them with the same way of thinking or even the same people than the ones who created them. So in this slide, I would like to give over the word to Edwin, but we need to quickly change the presentation as well, so that I can also keep an eye on the chat as well. So I'm going to stop the sharer here, and then I will ask Edwin to share his screen. Yes, you're sharing, Edwin. Good. You need to unmute, Edwin. So Edwin,
thank you, Tom. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for this this bridge. Actually, to be quite honest, I think Einstein with this quote is one of my heroes, because if you look at this quote, it's very clear that if you want to resolve issues for the future, you cannot think the same as you always have done. And I think Einstein in his time was a brilliant thinker, and he's learned us a lot with limited knowledge. So I think that's also one of the reasons why I believe that we need to actively search and look for other ways at our supply chain. I think the Corona crisis has shown us that the way we have built up our supply chain over the years is perhaps not the right one. We were not able to overcome all the problems which we had. Production was too far away, it was stopped, borders were closed, etc. The capacity, like transport, which we always felt was unlimited, was limited all of a sudden. So I think we need new kinds of inspirations to look at our supply chain. We need a kind of spark which really helps us to think in another way. But also we need to, let's say, work out a new vision. How should this world look like? What do we expect from each other, and how do we react? And I think also what we need to do much more is to learn from other industries, perhaps even from nature. I think nature teaches us a lot how you can resolve issues. I think there's a lot of power actually still lying in nature to be discovered. And I think we can use this kind of concepts to actively better, optimize our supply chain. So I think at the end of the day, we need to innovate together. I think innovation is key, and we need to do this in cooperation. And I think that's very clear. And what I think was very warming, actually the last month, what I've seen is that companies which were not involved with each other, they start to bundle their power, they work together to find solutions for the hospitals who didn't have enough masks. You know, a lot of initiatives from different industries brought people together and came up with new solutions. And I think we should really use this power also as a kind of inspiration for the future and looking ahead at COVID-19. To be quite honest, Tom and I, we don't have all the answers. Most likely we have as much questions as you do. but I think by getting together, we at least make the steps in finding solutions for these answers. So if you then look, let's say, from the perspective of inspiration, lots of topics, of course, are already defined, and we're working on them, especially at the university. We have a lot of discussions about coping with demand and supply uncertainty, or prescriptive analytics, or artificial intelligence, and how can we use that, or even about network optimization. But I think a lot of those things are very technical. And I think at the end of the day, the techniques don't save us. I think the collaboration of people and the working together of people actually saves us in finding solutions. So I think we need much more collaboration in these type of networks. And I think in the last years, I've been working for Hoyer, and I had a lot of customers who always called us their partners. But at the end of the day, we were just suppliers, which is not the same as a partner. So I think we need to more emphasize on how do we want to work together in those kind of networks. How do we work together horizontal, or how do we want to work vertically? And I, for instance, started a few years ago an initiative together with Eva Venedex in the Netherlands. That concept is called Compose, and that's basically much more about horizontal shipper collaboration. So how can shippers work more together? And the funny thing is that we already focused there on non-competitive collaboration. So I think a lot of the collaboration until now is done in conjunction of the same supply chain. But I think if you try to learn from other supply chains, you can go much further, perhaps not faster, but at least further. And this is what I call social innovation. So I think if we talk about the topic of how we have to innovate for the future, it's not only on knowledge, it's not only on process, but it's actually much more about how we are going to work together. And of course, you could argue with me, is this not way too soft? You know, we need action now. We need to have our supply chains resilience. We have to start up our industry. On the other hand, a lot of things we cannot do yet because still borders are closed, people are not working. So perhaps we can use this time to think about how we could do differently together. So, and talking about collaboration, I think Toyota already has proven us over the years, for the last 6 years actually, after World War II, that close collaboration in supply chain really pays off. I think the funny thing is that everybody knows the Toyotisme concept. It's about just-in-time principles, etc., Kanban. The funny thing, however, this theory was not invented in Japan. It was invented in the US, but it was applied in Japan after World War II, because basically those supply chains didn't have enough money and resources to keep a lot of stock. But of course, you could argue also in the talk of Tom that perhaps we need more stock in the supply chain. That's true, but it's not my point about more or less stock. It's about the way people are working together. And to show this, I added this graph. And this is a study done in 2000 by the company Dyer. And they actually did a research and they compared Toyota with the other 3 car manufacturers. What they found out is that Toyota outperformed the other 3 big car manufacturers on all kinds of things like less defects, more productivity, and better stock levels. And this is all due to the fact that they cooperated and worked together with their suppliers in a totally different manner as these 3 manufacturers. They actually sold their suppliers as real partners. So they worked on continuous improvement cycles. They sat together if they had a problem. And by doing that, so they created this win-win situation with all the benefits on hand. And mind you, these are the same suppliers. It's not a study between different suppliers. These were exactly the same suppliers supplying to Toyota, to GM, Chrysler, and to Ford. So the real effort that Toyota actually put into its suppliers really paid off for them. And this is also one of the reasons that wherever in the world you buy Toyota, everybody knows, even if you don't like a Toyota, it's the best car you can buy. You know, so I think that's very interesting. And I think this is for me a paramount idea about what the value is of collaboration. So my message is, at the end of the day, we really need, oh, sorry guys, we really need cooperation during this coronavirus crisis. I think this will eventually lead us and help us to come to new fundamental system innovations. And this should lead us towards a sustainable and resilient post-COVID-19 supply chain. Tom, for instance, he talked about multiple sourcing or dual sourcing. But in some cases, you could also think about, let's say, not only multiple dual sourcing, but also about alternative sourcing. So what I mean by that is that in my previous job, for instance, at Royal Flora Holland, I was also responsible for the development of sea container transport for flowers, for roses in this case. Until now, all flowers actually from Africa are flown in by airplanes. You can imagine that this last month, only a few flowers came out of Africa because all the capacity, air freight capacity, was reverted to other routes. So the growers in Africa now all of a sudden had a huge problem because they were always focusing on this one modality. But the funny thing is there is a solution at hand. It's called sea container transport. So I think you should also look in your supply chain, not only look at dual sourcing, but also at alternative sourcing. So for instance, use other modalities or other solutions, or use a supplier which is further away or closer by, etc. So I think this type of mixes could really help. And I already referred a little bit to it. I did in my previous job at Royal Flora Holland, I did a lot of projects with the community. And I think if you talk about collaboration, I think the horticultural industry in the Netherlands is most likely a world champion collaboration. But I really learned a lot from those projects because they gave me very important insight. If you want to do and work to collaborate, you need people and the right partners, and you need the people with the right knowledge, of course. But foremost, you need people with the right energy. If you really want to achieve something in such a situation, you need to put your money where your mouth is. Put energy and effort on it, and make sure that you're willing to work together, to change and to adopt to the new situation. This is the only way that you really are able to achieve a change. Because even the slightest, easiest new concepts are very hard to implement. I know that from experience. I also did a project to transport plants by train from the Netherlands to Italy. Not very complicated, but to change the way people work is really complicated. And I think you need people with the willingness to change and to adopt, and that makes all the difference between success or no success. So in my mind is, if we talk about pushing forward to the COVID-19, trying to change the way we look at the world, trying to innovate, you cannot do innovation without mental shift or social innovation. Please bear in mind that you, besides process and knowledge development, you also need the mental and behavior adaptation of that development. And I think it's very key if you want to work together with your partners, that you really work as a partner, you know, and involve their employees at all levels. So it's not only about having the right process at the end, it's not about having the right technology, but it's much more about the willingness to adapt, change and to adapt. And from my experience, what I've learned is think about a new concept. We a lot of intelligent people along the line. I think we can do that in 3 weeks. We can find out the new projects. We can do a project together with TU Eindhoven or with the Antwerp University Management School and do it in 6 months, the project. But adoption and implementation most likely takes years before becoming successful. But bear in mind, I think the most important thing is that if we want to learn and to change things for the coming years to come, we must make sure that we formulate the questions very right, that we have clear what the problem is, and come up with clear concepts, keep it simple, stupid, and work upon that. And also the understanding of the interest of the companies involved, of course, is very important. If you want to work closer with your partners in the supply chain, of course, you must make sure that there is a win-win situation, that all the interests are really served. one of my last projects at Schiphol. I worked with also a lot of community members, and the focus was really on the interest of the companies. It was not about the problems or the challenges. It was about the interest and where we see challenges and how we can overcome that by working on those challenges, and that all interests of these companies separately are addressed. So I think that's also a very important message in this context. So in these projects which I've done over the last 10 years, we also came up with 10 critical success factors for collaboration. I already started my introduction that I have a passion for change. I know it's the most difficult thing which we can do, but these points at least should help us by, let's say, getting the right collaboration and cooperation in place. Well, again, what I've learned is that the most important thing is actually to start simple. And I think also with the COVID-19, we should not make very big and ambitious projects, but let's make small steps. Like the Chinese say, a lot of small steps make a long journey, and I think we should also handle that or use that for the COVID-19 crisis. And what is also very important for me is to address behavior and trust. I think looking at somebody else's interest and making sure you're trustworthy as a partner in what situation you are is quite important to get the thing done, because if you want to work in a collaboration, then you need to be trustworthy. You know, that's how it is in my perspective. And last but not least, if you start to work together, it's also very important that you already upfront know when to enter a collaboration or even to exit. In some cases, you know, you don't have the right collaboration, so perhaps then it's better also to stop working together. So to put it together, from my perspective, looking at COVID-19, all the questions which we have and all the people who are now involved, we have so many people who are now looking at this webinar. I think you all have the same question. What is the solution for the future? And I think Tom and I, we're not capable to answer that by ourselves, but as a group, we are actually. So I think the power is in the group, and the willingness to share information, to share insights, and not to keep it for yourself will make the difference if we come up with new type of supply chains for the future. And if we are able to come perhaps with that brilliant idea, which looks a little bit like the container in the 50s. So the last slide is for you, Tom. Thank you for your attention. And if you have questions, then I'm hoping to hear them from you in the chat.
Okay. So I think the idea what we are talking about is clear in a sense. If you look at the picture of the boys, we probably don't want to be the thin boy, the thinnest boy. We don't want to be the smallest, the anorexic boy, but we might want to be a bit more heavier. And the question becomes a bit heavier is maybe not necessarily cost effective or cost efficient, and how do we find then the optimal size of the boy? Let's put it like this. I think also finding the optimal size of the boy or finding the boy does not work in a system where you say like Edwin was talking about, where you have a sort of a collaboration, which is not a true collaboration, but it's more a sort of a I'm buying something from you and every year it needs to be 10% cheaper, or I'm buying whatever. So that's not a true collaboration. So in terms of really moving forward and being able to have flexibility into your organization, you might need to invest in other things than efficiency, technology efficiency leading to cost minimization. But we might need to have explicitly some other dimensions into the picture, like resilience, like the risk mitigation kind of strategies. Interestingly, and that's a bit where you see some analogy is where we talk about sustainable supply chains. Everybody talks about sustainable supply chains. Everybody's talking about we should be sustainable, we should be reducing CO2 and so on and so on and so on. But it should be it should not cost us more money than it should be as if we would not take this dimension into account. I think this is probably the wrong, probably a wrong thinking about how can we protect ourselves against, or how can we improve upon sustainability. And then we have to find um, different ways of combining these different KPIs into one. Into a good dashboard type of function, but it would be of course fantastic if we could find some ways where cost effective is also going together with risk mitigation, is going together with resilience, is going together with sustainability, so that it is not the trade-off, but it is and. And I think at least our claim at least is that this cannot be done alone. This needs to be done in true collaboration, through partnerships, and where we probably can do a lot, where we can probably do more than if we are trying to squeeze out everybody in the supply chain. And this is the fourth or fifth level in the supply chain, whatever. This is probably not the right way of looking forward into the supply chain. So I think it would be more, that would probably be a bit more old school thinking, cost reduction, cost efficiency, let's try to do better. On the other hand, there are many more dimensions which seem to be helping out and which seem to be moving into the direction. And we see some first sites, some first indications like Edwin was talking about, which might need to be helping us out in terms of shaping the future supply chain. Do we know how this future supply chain will look like? No, and I think that's also what Edwin says as a conclusion. We probably need to identify what is making sense. If you go back to the boys, if the picture of the boys, is the thinnest boy making sense, is the thickest boy making sense, or is it somewhere in between? And unfortunately, usually these kind of things are not linear, because then it would be easy, but there's probably some non-linearities in there, and depending on which stakeholder in the supply chain, there might be some different trade-offs to be made. But that's, I think, the challenge, and that's also the interesting part of how we expect type of trade-offs we will be seeing into the future when we are talking to companies, when we are talking to how are we going to shape up the supply chain after Corona, what did we learn from Corona, and so on. My learning, at least from Corona, is this pure lean and very, let's say, skinny supply chains are probably not making sense anymore, especially for large disruptions. Having said that, I would like to, at least this is a bit what I wanted to say with this slide. So I think the next slide is more about questions and answers. So can you move to the next slide, Edwin? Yeah, and then we came to an end of this webinar, in a sense, the period where we are talking and you are listening. So I think it would be nice to hear some feedback from you on what we were talking about and how you see this. And I also see in the chat some similar type of discussions, in the sense that there is an operational efficiency, a cost focus, and there is also a discussion about long-term behavior versus quartile behavior, that you need to basically create each time a percent, you need to create value every quartile, but this probably needs also some longer-term behavior and looking further than having shareholder value stuff. There is a question, I think it would be from Marcella, about how to make a difference in the future if everyone is collaborating. Edwin, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. The funny thing is that basically also what I think what we saw is that with the example which I showed you with the suppliers, for the big car manufacturers and Toyota, everybody is already collaborating, but in the way they collaborate, it's not the same. So I think that makes a difference from a quality perspective. On the other hand, we also know that if we look at the parts industry, if we look at high tech, a lot of the companies like Apple, they use the Samsung screens. So, and at the end of the day, people still buy an Apple instead of instead of a Samsung. So I think at the end of the day, it's all about marketing. It's much more about marketing and less about the collaboration and how we set up the supply chain. I think in a lot of cases, the supply chain does not always. You don't have to have your own supply chain. That's my point. If you look at, let's say, the gasoline distribution in the past, Shell had his own truck. Now there's a wide fleet. So, and still some people are, let's say, fill the car at Mobile, the other ones at Shell. So I think the issue is that the collaboration doesn't make the difference there, but the marketing does.
Okay, good. So what do you think the world will be after this pandemic in economical way? So I think you mean how would it be evolving economically speaking? Yeah, I think this is probably nobody really knows about how this will evolve into the future. And obviously we will be going economically, we will be seeing a little bit of a slowing down and probably going back quite severe depending on which sector we are talking about. But that's also why it's so important to learn from these kind of things. Huh? So it's really important to understand where did we go wrong, what did go wrong in the supply chain, and how can we somehow work around this into the future so that this does not happen anymore. And I think that's a bit our statement is that probably one of the reasons why we are now seeing that. We are running into trouble is because of the fact that we do not have enough meat on the bone. We don't have enough buffer in any possible way to actually mitigate for this kind of extreme things. Now, the funny thing is, of course, if you somehow look at the demand, you could also, of course, say, hey, demand is quite easy to forecast. But of course, going from millions of pieces per week to nothing is of course very different, and that's of course an extreme one. So the probably the underlying question is whether you would überhaupt be able to actually forecast or mitigate for these kind of extreme things. But that's why it's so important to understand what happened and how can we actually go around with these kind of things so that it is not a loss, so that we don't see these as a sort of a let's go back to business as usual once Corona is gone. Because then in 5 years from now, we might be again into another type of extreme unknown. And then we might not be, we did not learn anything from this crisis. So never waste a good crisis. So learn from it.
There's some interesting questions. So there's, for instance, this question about will the jobs for supply chain be affected in Europe? And I think it's also a little bit related to the economics. I think what you see by now is that a lot of people are actually discussing if future investments need to be done in China or more closer at home. I think for the European market, I would state that I think a lot of industries will really evaluate if they want to invest further away or let's close by, let's say in Eastern Europe, where there's still a lot of opportunities. So I think this will have an effect on where people are going to do their next investment. Whereas actually for the EU would not be too bad if we invest more into EU countries instead of invested somewhere else in the world. So it will give a totally new dynamic, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and the other thing is there is a question on blockchain. So I think blockchain is a technology enabling certain things. So it will help us to do certain things, but it will not be the solution, of course. It will be an enabler. It's a technology enabler doing certain things, but I'm not sure. So it will help to create trust. It will help to create a single source of truth and these kind of things, but it's an enabler of doing something. I think the starting point also, like Edwin was mentioning, it starts, of course, with people. It starts with understanding and so on, so on. So I'm just scanning a little bit in the other comments because I need to go back a little bit. So how do we encourage the board to go for long term if it is a pain and less revenue? I'm not sure whether the revenue is a problem. I think it's more about potentially more cost you have to make because you need to buffer, you need to protect yourself, you need to maybe um, put in more safety capacity in probably other ways but this is now sort of thinking aloud of what could be there. um, I think even it could be more revenue at a certain point, because if you're able to do this in an adequate way, and let's say pandemics, I don't hope this is the case, will be the normal, will be the known unknown, so we can actually prepare. We know this is going to be happening every year in waves, and we don't get good vaccines, then I think probably if you're able to mitigate for these kind of risks better, than even in let's say in the harder times, you're basically going to keep selling, you still keep your revenue stream up to the right level somehow. Of course, it's easier said than done. So I think we are all talking about what could be, and it depends on your specific business, your specific sector, your specific game you're playing, and how this will be, of course, evolving is not always completely clear. Okay,
Yeah,
I'm just
sorry, can I add something to that, Tom? Because
yeah,
I think this question, I think this is also about leadership. We did not touch upon the fact of leadership. I think this also goes to the direction of never waste a good crisis. I think you see that a lot of industries actually struggle, for instance, for the implementation of digitalization, because they always said that certain things were not doable, and now we see we do that. So I think if you have a very good board, then they will do the things which everybody said was impossible. So I think in that sense, it's leadership. You need to have the balls to invest in a time where they go and get stuff. So, and I've also seen it in my own project where people do not invest at the moment, that an investment, for instance, in digitalization would really help for the breakthrough, not only today, but also for the long run. Okay, Tom?
Yep, thank you. So I think I was just looking at the role of logistics service sector in the optimization post-corona of the supply chains. I think that's an interesting one. I think we also had at the Antwerp Management School a webinar with Alex van Bredam, who was also partially looking into how these kind of logistic service providers are going to operate and act. So obviously they are going to be a partner in, but that's really I select my word now, they need to be a partner in these kind of discussions, because it's probably in a collaboration type of role that they can be a service provider, but also be a solution provider, and really thinking along with the stakeholders, with the prime problem owners, to actually see what can be done best. Obviously, these service providers are also now hitting quite some limits, apparently, because they are also seeing shortage in containers. They are always in the wrong place. They see a shortage in air freight. They see shortage in last mile delivery. They see shortages everywhere. So they are also basically are running into problems in terms of making sure that they have sufficient capacity. Additionally, they also run into, of course, the same issue, because they're also cost driven. So they also want to have everything as cheap as possible, especially in their lower downstream operators they're using. So you see that it's I don't have a clear direct answer on that one, but of course they will be important. But I think, like Edwin was saying, everybody, all the stakeholders, all the partners in the supply chain will be needed to do something there. Axel de Kimpe asked, how can we improve the last mile in the supply chain? That's actually a very good question, but I need probably another week to talk about that one, because that's a completely different research domain and a different type of discussion, especially in this broader sense, how to improve the last mile in the supply chain. So if you would like to have more discussion, let's do this offline then, or at least also online, but not in this webinar, so that we can talk a bit more in details about these kind of things. Okay. I think most of the questions are now more, at least up to a certain point, handled. I see Alex also, Alex van Bredam is also in the call. He says, indeed, building communities. And I think that's also maybe a good way of stopping. I think it's not about doing it alone. It's not about squeezing out everybody, but it's about partnerships. It's about building a shared interest with each other, and then trying to get forward with these type of supply chains, and really get away from the standard, let's say, negatively put boardroom thinking about cost minimization. But let's go beyond that, and let's try to get in terms of, they always talk about the supply or industry 4.0 or whatever. Let's go to a 5 or a 6 or a 2021, whatever, I don't care. But let's get out of the standard thinking, and let's move forward and take into account other factors which are extremely important here, and which actually so that in a sense the corona crisis is not wasted, but we actually learn tremendously from this one.
Is there still room to answer one question? Because I think there's an interesting question for Axel de Kimper. He says collaboration is very difficult, certainly across cultures and languages, so the adaptability part of resilience is crucial. So I just want to comment on the first part. Yeah, from my own experience, at the moment you really are truly interested in your partner, so the person who's behind the company, so you'll be able to build a bond with them and to work from a personal perspective in that partnership. I think culture doesn't matter anymore. If you want to work as companies to companies, and you only look at your company's culture without having an eye for the true interest of the other company, then it will not work. So I think at the end of the day, it's all about people, and I already said that before. So if you want to work in close collaboration with anybody, you need to understand and know that person. And of course, digitalization is nice, webinars are nice, but at the end of the day, it's all about sitting down with a cup of coffee and getting more interested in those people and what they, let's say, motivates them as a person, and from that perspective, motivates them to work for that company. So this is how I wanted to answer this question.
Very good. So yeah. So I see. Johan was sending a message about possible shift from supply chains if you go global to global or global to region, China, Europe, to more regional supply chain or supply networks. Probably it's not an or, but probably it's a sort of an and. We probably need to have both somehow and that makes it probably again difficult in terms of complexity. But I think it's probably the fact that we are, let's say, potentially running out of medication is because all the medication is produced in China. So I'm making it a bit black and white now. So the problem is, if we can, or the issue is that can we solve this by also still doing some production locally into the region, whatever. So it's probably not or, but it's probably the combination of these two. So okay. Could you touch upon briefly on how organizations would look at inventory management in the post-COVID-19 world? Oh,
next seminar.
What did you say? Huh?
I said next seminar.
Yeah. That's a very good question, Shreyas. But let's say I think so. What I teach the students in day one, is that most of what we are talking about in supply chain is talking about cost minimization. Inventory management is exactly the same. We basically try to balance costs in terms of ordering, holding, out of stock cost, and or back order type of costs. So probably in a sense the basic starting point of the inventory control rules might already be not very correct, because they already more connected to the traditional thinking about cost minimization. So the question becomes, how can we somehow make this trade-off there, or this change there, or have a multi-objectives into account? I have no idea. It's a fantastic new research area, which I really have to think about, and probably need some PhD students to work on that. But it's an interesting thought about how do we how do we get away from a single objective, cost minimization, to probably more multi-objective type of trade-offs, where we take into account resilience, sustainability, and so on into account.
So is it an idea also, Tom, to now just add to the audience that from TUA perspective, OPAC is also working on a project about COVID?
Yeah, good, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, so from TUA perspective, we now work also on the project to look at what the impact is of COVID on the manufacturing industry. This program is called DASCO-VIMI, and we will have a website very soon live, and you will also be able to track the developments over there. We will also work together with companies like New Ways, ASML, but also DSV and Eros Cargo Care to look what the impact is in their supply chain with their partners of the COVID crisis, and also to learn really from that. We have a lot of questions, but we'll also be learning. So I think we need to work upon that. So to be continued, I would say.
Yes. So if you, I'm aware that we probably did not answer all questions properly, or to the extent you might wanted to hear the answers. But obviously, both Edwin and myself are available for more discussions, for more feedback, also hearing your opinion on how certain things should be evolving, possible collaboration. Also, we have of course, obviously, good students available. If you would like to get connected to the Antwerp Management School, let us know. And we will get into further discussion about how do these supply chains evolve into the future. I gave my email address in the chat. I also see that Edwin mentioned the DASCO-VIMI project, which is really focusing on after Corona, what do we learn and how to move forward from there. So that's also, there will be also some regular updates also coming out of that one. So please connect to us if you would like to hear more from us. And I was extremely happy to see so many people here. And at a certain point, we were 110 people, I think, over here. So thank you very much for attending this webinar. Please take care, stay safe, and please connect to us if you need to know more. And I would like to end the webinar over here now. So thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you too.
See you. Bye-bye.
See you. Bye-bye.